Welcome to yet another episode of me comparing apples to oranges. On today's menu, we got a comparison between this guy, the Leica Q2, and the camera that I'm filming on right now, the Sony a7 Mark IV. Yeah, I know. Don't click away though, I promise you that it will make sense in the end. Probably. Now, those of you who have been around for a while now will know that the Leica Q2 has been my go-to camera for about 2 years now, and I've pretty much carried it with me every time I left the house within that time. And I've also taken it on a couple of trips all around the world, from New York to Iceland to Italy a couple of times, the Netherlands, France, I don't know, other places probably as well. Oh yeah, and a big trip to southern England. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that I do know this camera with all of its strengths and weaknesses pretty damn well. The Sony, on the other hand, has been my workhorse camera for about a year now, meaning that I've used it to film almost all of my videos for this YouTube channel in that time, and I've also taken it on a couple of trips and taken a couple of photos with it. But still, even though I've been using it for a full year now, I'd still say that I'm not quite on a first name basis with this camera. It still just feels a bit foreign to me. So anyway, a few weeks ago I posted a video comparing the Sony a7 Mark IV to my previous workhorse camera, which was the Fuji X-T4. And on that video and in my Instagram DMs, there's one question that just kept popping up again and again, and that is, for a Fuji user who wants to quote-unquote upgrade to full frame, would I recommend to go with a Sony system or maybe something like a Leica? And that's why I'm making this video today. Now, just as a side note, if I had the money to just go out and buy a Leica Q3 and a Sony a7CR to compare these two, I think that would make for a much closer and much more sensible comparison, as these two cameras are a lot closer in terms of their specs and also how they look. But I don't have that kind of money, so I have to make do with what I got. Oh yeah, and while we're on that subject, I also do not have a 28mm lens for the Sony, so I'm just going to use my 24mm G Master lens with the Sony for comparison, which might not be entirely fair, but that's just what we're going to do. With that being said though, a lot of people have argued that the 28mm lens that you get on the Leica Q2 in reality is a bit wider than an actual 28mm lens field of view, so most people agree that it's more in the range of a 25 to 26mm lens. So I think comparing it to the 24mm G Master might not be that far off after all. So with all of that out of the way, let's compare some cameras, shall we? So let's start with the obvious. These two are very different looking cameras. One has a rangefinder style body, one has an SLR style body. The Sony has an interchangeable lens mount, so you got all of the flexibility in the world. The Leica, on the other hand, offers a fixed 28mm lens, which looks like a disadvantage at first, but it is a very solid lens, this one. Incredibly sharp, beautiful contrast. It's got that three-dimensional effect that Leica is known for. Good bokeh for a wide lens too. There is a bit of a debate if this 28mm lens is actually a 28mm lens in terms of its field of view, but we'll just push that issue to the side for now. And since I'm comparing it to a 24mm G Master lens anyway, I don't really care. While we are talking about the 24mm G Master, same thing basically, outstanding image quality, incredible colors and contrast. I have had this lens for just a few weeks now, but it's already my favorite Sony lens of all times. The bodies are obviously also very different in the sense that the Sony is very ergonomically pleasing, whereas the Leica is very aesthetically pleasing. Meaning that the Sony just has that solid grip and feels very secure in your hands, whereas the Leica Q2, well, it needs a bit more mindfulness. And yeah, I know that you can get extra grips and a thumb rest and all that for the Q2, but if you ask me, that's just missing the point. If you want a Leica with a good grip and the size and the looks of the camera don't really concern you, well, you can always just get the SL2. And also, in all reality, I have used the Leica Q2 for 2 years now without any of the aforementioned accessories, and I've not dropped it once, not even close. So yeah, again, the Sony feels a lot more secure, but both are fine in my opinion, especially because you are not going to mount any bigger lenses on the Leica Q2. If you could, which would obviously be fantastic, mount something like a 70 to 200 millimeter lens on this, I'd say yeah, the grip is certainly inadequate, but since you only got the small-ish 28mm lens, I think it's perfectly fine. And one more thing, especially while we're on the subject of size, in my personal experience, the Leica Q2 draws a lot less attention to itself than the Sony. And I know some people might disagree on this, especially because this Leica camera obviously shows the Leica brand, and people who know will know that this is a fairly expensive camera, but even though Leica is certainly a household name within the camera industry and among camera enthusiasts, I don't think that most people out on the streets would really recognize that name brand. It's a bit similar, in my opinion, to other stuff like watches, albeit not nearly on the same level in terms of prices, but just think about it this way. Most people will recognize a Rolex watch and the Rolex name brand, but I think far fewer people would actually bat an eye if they saw something like a Patek Philippe Nautilus out in the wild, because most people probably just don't know what they are looking at. Even though Patek is certainly well known amongst enthusiasts and certainly also a lot more expensive than most of the Rolexes out there. So anyway, aside from the occasional polite nod from like other people who are running around with their cameras on the street, nobody has actually talked to me about the Leica Q2 within the 2 years that I've owned it. Whereas the same can absolutely not be said about even my Fuji X-T4, which I've gotten a few compliments for, or people just noticing it and mentioning it in conversations. And it's certainly also not true in regards to the Sony, or even back in the days, my Canon DSLRs. Because when I whipped a Canon DSLR out of my bag and started taking photos in a restaurant or at a family gathering or whatever, people just immediately noticed it and started behaving very differently, which is just not the case with the Leica. I can document my daily life and my family life all day long and barely anyone will even notice. Part of that, aside from just the size of the body, is obviously also down to how loud these cameras are. Just take a listen to the shutter sound of the Sony a7 Mark IV and then the Leica Q2. That is quite a difference, isn't it? So yeah, in conclusion, I would say that the Leica Q2, in my experience at least, is a lot less intimidating and noticeable as a camera. So it's easier to use and easier to use for documenting your life and probably also street photography. But I don't do a lot of street photography, so I can't really tell from a first-hand experience. Anyway, since we're talking about these cameras and prices, let's just do a quick price comparison, shall we? Now, I can't really compare the prices between the Leica Q2 and the Sony a7 Mark IV. It just wouldn't be right because the Q2 isn't even out on the market anymore and the a7 Mark IV is pretty much on sale, it seems like, the entire time. But just for shits and giggles, let's do it anyway. So I was able to find the Leica Q2 on mpb.com for around 4 grand, used in excellent conditions. And you can get a Sony a7C Mark II, which is basically a Sony a7 IV, just in a rangefinder style of body. And you can get that body with a 24mm G Master lens for about 3,800 bucks. So there's only about 200 euros difference between the Leica Q2, albeit used, and the Sony a7C Mark II with a 24mm G Master lens. Not really that big of a difference, but since we're talking about price comparisons, let's also try a bit more of an apples to apples comparison and look at the prices of the Leica Q3 and the Sony a7CR just for a quick second. So the Leica Q3 currently costs around 6 grand here in Germany, and you can get the Sony a7CR with the 24mm G Master lens for about 5,200 euros. So there is about a 750 euros difference in between those two camera setups, and some of that is certainly down to just the name brand Leica, but I don't think it's fair to say that it's all of it, because first of all, with the Leica Q3 you do get the ability to shoot 8K video, and the Leica Q3, unlike the Leica Q2, also does have a face detect autofocusing system, which is fairly modern, and it does also shoot log, so all of that is good. And probably far more important to me, the electronic viewfinder on the Sony A7CR is apparently fairly bad, with a resolution of just 2.36 megapixels, if I remember correctly, whereas even the Q2 comes in at around 4 megapixels, and so does the A7 Mark IV, by the way. And the Leica Q3 sports a solid 5.6 or so megapixel electronic viewfinder, and that does certainly make a huge difference in terms of the usability, at least if you use that electronic viewfinder a lot, which I certainly do. So I think just on those two features alone, the price difference of about 750 euros might even be justified. And again, you're obviously also paying more for the name, but also for the fact that the Leica Q3 is produced in Germany, which just adds to the cost. With all that in mind though, I would conclude with saying that Leica cameras aren't really as overpriced as a lot of people make them out to be. With that out of the way though, let's get back to these two cameras, and with the comparison of the bodies and the overall features out of the way, let's get into the image quality. So okay, I'm not going to do any kind of intense pixel peeping here. I just honestly don't care about that. And I'm also not planning to do any sort of scientific testing. And also, let's just be real here, both of these cameras are certainly capable of putting out great images in the right hands, meaning that a good photographer will certainly be able to get great results with either of these cameras. With that being said, I actually think that these two cameras are fairly close in terms of image quality, at least in well-lit environments. In my very subjective and uninformed opinion though, I would say that I still prefer the images from the Leica, as they just look a bit more characterful to me. I don't know how else to describe it. The images out of the Sony are great, don't get me wrong, especially with the 24mm G Master, but I personally just prefer the look I get out of the Leica files. I think the Leica really has that 3D lifelike look to it. I don't know if that's just my imagination or any sort of bias maybe, or there is some dark Leica wizardry at play, or you know, maybe just the color science and the glass, but that's just how I feel about it. Things do, however, get a bit more interesting when we're talking about low light performance, so let's do that. So the Leica Q2 was my first ever full frame camera, and I bought it basically as a replacement for my previous EDC camera, the Fujifilm X100V. And one of my main reasons to quote-unquote upgrade was the low light performance, because the Fuji, with its APS-C sensor and no in-body image stabilization, and the f2 lens, just wasn't very strong in the dark. You could still get some good pictures or just shrug the ISO noise off as grain, but the images certainly didn't look clean. The Q2 now sports a full frame sensor with IBIS and an f1.7 aperture lens, and therefore it's much better than the Fuji in low light conditions. But truth be told, in my opinion, that is mostly down to the IBIS and therefore being able to reduce the shutter speed in low light situations, plus the faster aperture, and not the fact that the Q2 produces significantly cleaner images at higher ISOs. Because it really doesn't. I mean, yeah, cleaner than the APS-C Fuji perhaps, but when you compare it to what the Sony is capable of, it's just quite a big difference. And that's before we get into the fact that with the Sony, we would technically also be able to really open up that aperture to f1.4 to let in even more light. Also, the autofocusing system on the Leica Q2 is certainly nothing to write home about, even at the best of times. But when you're approaching more difficult conditions, like low light conditions, it really starts to struggle. The Sony, on the other hand, is really able to just hold its own, even on those conditions. So yeah, don't get me wrong, the Leica Q2 certainly still works in the dark, and you can absolutely get some great results even in low light conditions. And also, obviously, some of the difference in low light performance is simply down to the fact that the Leica Q2 has almost a 50% higher pixel density, so that obviously accounts for probably quite a big margin of the difference. But at the same time, I think that the Sony with its 33 megapixel sensor is just the perfect hybrid camera in many regards, but also in the sense that you do get a fairly high megapixel count, because 33 megapixels is still quite a lot, but it's still not as high as, you know, a lot of modern cameras like 50 megapixels, 60 megapixel. And with that, you get just really good low light performance. But even with that being said, and even though I do absolutely admire just how capable the Sony is and how versatile the system is and how many great lenses you got available for the Sony system, I still somehow just prefer the images that I get out of my Leica Q2. For whatever reason, and I honestly don't understand it myself, I find it fairly easy to edit the files that I get out of the Leica in Lightroom and get them to exactly where I want them to be. It usually just takes me a few seconds per image in Lightroom, where honestly, I struggle a bit with most of the images that I get out of my Sony to, again, get them to where I want them to be. Now, I'm obviously not saying that you cannot do great edits with the Sony files in Lightroom, because obviously you can, and there are photographers far more talented than I am who've just gotten great results for years on ends now with their Sony cameras. So really just take that with a bucket load of salt, but that's just my experience. I just prefer to work with the Leica files over the files that I get out of my Sony. It's just what it is. Okay, when we're talking about video performance, there really is just no comparison. The Leica can shoot 4K video in 10-bit at 30 FPS, but there's no flat profile, no log profile, the autofocus is unreliable even at the best of times, and the files are huge. You cannot even record 4K video unless you got one of them super fast SD cards in here. There is also no input for external audio, and yes, you probably still get some good videos and just record your audio externally and whatever and use manual focus all of the time and all of that, but this camera is certainly not made for video. The Q3 is a lot better in terms of the features that it offers for video recording. The Q2, however, just isn't. The Sony, on the other hand, is just a completely different story. You get 10-bit files, log profiles for days, even 4K 60, albeit with a crop, a flip screen for those creative angles or filming yourself, additional electronic stabilization on top of your in-body sensor stabilization, the best autofocusing system in the business, and again, that low light performance. The Leica craps out at an embarrassing 6400 ISO in video mode. What a disgrace. The Sony, on the other hand, can go up to ISO 102,400. So you got headroom for days in low light conditions. Just watch these two side by side. Observe as the Sony just absolutely shits on the Leica in video mode, spits in its face, calls it a bitch and wipes the floor with it. It's not close, not at all. So if you want a hybrid camera for both photos and videos and you're looking at these two, well, there's really only one option. With all that being said, the same is probably not true anymore if we're talking about the Q3 and the Sony a7CR. But again, I don't have the two, so we're just comparing what I got here. Now, there are more things that I haven't really touched on in this video in the interest of your time, like the overall usability, screens, menus, custom buttons, button placement, and all that. That stuff is of course very important, but it's also incredibly boring and tedious to talk about. If you care about that sort of stuff, it's probably best to just go to your local dealer and play with these cameras for yourself. But also there are just the more intangible aspects of a camera, and if you've watched any of my previous Leica Q2 videos, you will probably know what's coming next. And it's the simple fact that the Leica will make you want to use it to shoot all the time. Every day, every night. It will make you want to go out, go on adventures, go have new experience, spend just a ton of money on trips, all as an excuse to just use it more and more and more. It really is kind of addictive in a way that no other camera has been for me previously. Not even the absolutely fantastic Fuji X100V. And yes, I don't like the files that I get straight out of the camera, and I've stated that in previous videos on many occasions. But as I said earlier, I am able to manipulate every image within just a matter of seconds in Lightroom and get them to a point where they just absolutely pop. So all that just makes for a very rewarding experience overall, and also the memories that you get from it are just priceless. The same is, however, not true when we're talking about the Sony, at least not in my very personal opinion. Again, while I do have huge respect for what this Sony camera is capable of, and I wouldn't want to miss it as a workhorse camera, and also I have to say that my passion for the Sony camera has certainly grown a lot since I got that 24mm G Master lens, but still it's just not on par with the Leica for me. Even with this G Master lens, I still just don't feel inspired to just go and grab the Sony and go out on an adventure. If I do, I will always just bring the Leica Q2 instead. But again, all of that is just highly subjective, and as I've seen in the comments of my previous video where I compared the Fujifilm X-T4 to the Sony a7 Mark IV, some people agree with that and others just violently disagree, and they have a great time with their Sony and they feel just highly inspired. I don't know why exactly, the Sony magic just doesn't seem to work on me, but that's just how it is. Apparently a good number of people agree with this, but also there's a great number of users who completely just disagree. So that's probably something that you will have to find out for yourself, or maybe find out if that even matters to you at all, because as a tool, the Sony is certainly a very solid camera, and if all you want is a tool to just be creative and make your art, the Sony is just a great choice in that regard. Anyway, let's just leave it at that because it's a bit of a touchy subject. You will probably just have to figure this out for yourself. But anyway, that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If this was interesting to you, please let me know by giving this video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. And with that, I see you in the next video. Take care. Bye.